If you grew up blasting Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, or Tupac, you know the power of West Coast hip-hop. It wasn't just music, it was an identity. West Coast hip-hop was more than just beats and rhymes. It was a revolution that transformed the culture, told stories no one else would, and gave a voice to people who had been silenced for too long. It wasn't just about rapping into a mic. It was about culture, attitude, and the raw emotion of the streets. When the world talks about hip-hop, they often first mention the East Coast. New York, with its iconic boroughs and its early days of breakdancing, turntablism, and street culture, is often regarded as the birthplace of hip-hop. However, something was bubbling on the other side of the country in California, a sound, an energy, and an undeniable presence that would soon shake the foundations of the music industry and the world at large. The origins of West Coast hip-hop weren't tied to a singular event or an overnight success story. It was a slow brewing movement, rooted in the struggles of everyday people living in the streets of Los Angeles, in a city famed for its sunshine, palm trees, and Hollywood glamour. A different kind of story was being told on the streets, a story of poverty, gang violence, police brutality, and survival. And that story was about to be put to music. It wasn't the glitzy version of Los Angeles that the world saw in the movies. It was the version that lived in the shadows, the forgotten neighborhoods, the parts of the city that were overlooked by the media, the parts that had been ignored by mainstream society for far too long. Hip-hop gave these communities a way to express themselves and to let the world know they existed. But more importantly, it gave them a way to tell their truth. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the East Coast was home to hip-hop's earliest and most influential pioneers. Artists like Kool Herc, Grandmaster Flash, and Afrika Bambaataa. These were the names that defined the genre in its early days, developing the foundational elements like breakbeats, turntablism, and rapping. Hip-hop wasn't just music, it was a movement, a cultural revolution that united young people from all walks of life. But while this was all happening in New York, a very different kind of hip-hop was starting to bubble up on the West Coast. Los Angeles in particular was a city filled with contrast. It was a sprawling urban landscape where the rich lived on one side of town and the poor struggled on the other. While Hollywood made dreams come true for some, for others, survival was a constant fight. Hip-hop in LA wasn't a glamorous affair. It was about raw reality. Street corner ciphers, backyard parties, and late-night gatherings in the neighborhoods where youth had few options but to use music as an outlet. The first whispers of West Coast hip-hop came not from big studios or famous producers, but from small local crews. One of the earliest groups to play a significant role in West Coast hip-hop's development was Egyptian Lover. He was one of the pioneers who blended electronic music with the early sounds of rap, helping shape the early sound that would later influence the G-Funk era. He, along with other early artists like Uncle Jam's Army and Ice-T, was crucial in bringing the West Coast sound to the underground, where it began to take shape. Egyptian Lover and his contemporaries were inspired by the electronic music of the time, with influences from funk, electro, and disco. The West Coast wasn't just creating rap, it was creating something uniquely its own. Instead of the fast-paced rhythms and energetic breakbeats of the East Coast, the West Coast sound was slower, smoother, and more laid back. It had deep bass lines, funky melodies, and the kind of rhythm that made you feel the music in your chest. It wasn't about speed or complexity, it was about groove. By the mid-1980s, Ice-T had begun to emerge as one of the biggest names in the LA rap scene. Ice-T was one of the first rappers on the West Coast to gain mainstream attention. His rhymes were more than just clever wordplay. They were stories of the street, filled with dark imagery and the struggles of life in the inner city. Ice-T wasn't just rapping about his neighborhood, he was rapping about the world that everyone in LA knew, but no one wanted to talk about. His tracks like 6 in the Morning painted pictures of gang life and the harsh realities of the streets. However, for all the momentum West Coast hip-hop was building, it still hadn't broken through to the mainstream. Hip-hop as a genre was still very much a New York-centric movement. West Coast artists were producing music and making names for themselves, but they were still considered outsiders to the larger hip-hop scene. That would all change in 1987 with the formation of one of the most important groups in hip-hop history, N.W.A. N.W.A. wasn't just a group, it was a revolution. Hailing from Compton, California, the group consisted of Dr. Dre, Ice Cube, Eazy-E, MC Ren, and DJ Yella. Together, they were not just making music, they were creating a movement, a sound, and an attitude that would forever change the hip-hop landscape. Their music was raw, aggressive, and unapologetic. It wasn't just about rhyming, it was about making a statement. In 1988, N.W.A. released their groundbreaking album, Straight Outta Compton. The album's title track became an instant anthem, a declaration of the group's origins and their intent to shake up the world. But it was the song Fuck the Police that truly made waves. The track, which directly addressed police brutality and the racial profiling that many African Americans faced in L.A., was so controversial that it was banned by the FBI. However, this only added to the group's notoriety and cemented their status as the voice of the streets. N.W.A. didn't just make music that was shocking, they made music that was necessary. In a time when police brutality was an unspoken issue for many in America, N.W.A.'s blunt lyrics gave a voice to those who had been ignored and silenced for far too long. In doing so, they also set the tone for what was to come, a new kind of hip-hop that wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. The success of N.W.A. wasn't just about the music, it was about the culture they created. They were the first rap group to make the streets of Compton the focus of their storytelling, and they weren't afraid to address issues like gang violence, drugs, and the systemic oppression that shaped the lives of the people living in these neighborhoods. Their success was proof that hip-hop was more than just a genre. It was a movement, a vehicle for social change and self-expression. With Straight Outta Compton, N.W.A. went from being a local sensation to an international force. The album went platinum, and suddenly, the West Coast had a voice. It wasn't just a voice in the underground, it was a voice that was being heard worldwide. While N.W.A.'s sound was loud, aggressive, and in your face, it wasn't long before a new sound emerged from the West Coast. This new sound was smoother, more melodic, and just as powerful. It was called G-Funk. G-Funk was a subgenre of hip-hop that fused gangsta rap with funk, soul, and a laid-back, smooth vibe. At the forefront of this new movement was none other than Dr. Dre. Dre had already made a name for himself as the producer behind N.W.A.'s success, but it was his 1992 album, The Chronic, that solidified his place as one of the greatest producers in hip-hop history. The Chronic didn't just feature the West Coast's trademark sound, it defined it. With The Chronic, Dre introduced the world to Snoop Dogg, a young rapper with a smooth delivery and an undeniable charisma. Snoop Dogg's debut album, Doggy Style, dropped just a year later and was an instant classic. The album went straight to #1, and Snoop became a household name. His laid-back flow and distinct voice made him a perfect fit for Dre's G-Funk sound. Dre's production was revolutionary. He used deep bass lines, layered funk samples, and synth melodies to create a sound that was both modern and timeless. It was music that you could nod your head to, but it was also music that made you feel like you were floating in a lowrider car, cruising down the streets of LA. The G-Funk sound took over the airwaves and cemented the West Coast's dominance in the hip-hop world. But even as Dre and Snoop's popularity soared, the West Coast was still more than just a place. It was a culture, a lifestyle. And the artists who came out of this scene weren't just rapping, they were telling their stories. They were creating something bigger than themselves. By the time the early 90s rolled around, West Coast hip-hop had firmly planted itself as a dominant force in the genre. The underground movement that began in the streets of Los Angeles had quickly transcended regional boundaries and become a global phenomenon. No longer confined to the back alleys and low-budget studios of Compton and South Central, the West Coast was now on the map as the hub for hip-hop innovation, setting trends in both music and lifestyle. The West Coast's influence spread beyond the music. It defined an entire culture. The G-Funk sound, characterized by deep bass, slow-rolling beats, and funk samples, was the perfect soundtrack for a new era. The culture embraced a laid-back, yet hard-hitting ethos that echoed the streets of LA. West Coast hip-hop wasn't just music, it was a way of life. It was a reflection of a generation's defiance, its struggles, and its desire for respect. And while the industry slowly began to embrace it, the streets were where West Coast hip-hop was born and bred. Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and the rise of Death Row Records were at the center of this shift. Dre, with his revolutionary production on The Chronic, proved that the West could not only compete with the East Coast, but that it could define the future of the genre. Snoop Dogg's effortless delivery and magnetic persona elevated him from a local talent to a global icon, making Doggy Style one of the most successful rap albums of all time. As these two stars emerged, Death Row Records grew into a powerhouse. Founded by Dr. Dre and Suge Knight, Death Row wasn't just a record label, it was a cultural juggernaut. The label defined the sound of the 90s, but it was more than that. Death Row was synonymous with power, dominance, and the uncompromising attitude that West Coast hip-hop had become known for. However, with this success came inevitable complications. The energy that had propelled the West Coast into the spotlight also fueled the tensions within the industry, particularly between the West Coast and East Coast rap scenes. The rift between these coasts wasn't just a battle of sounds, it was a cultural war, and at its heart was the increasing rivalry between two of the biggest names in rap, Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. Tupac Shakur wasn't just another rapper. He was an enigma. A poet, a philosopher, and a revolutionary, Tupac embodied the power of music to transform lives and change culture. He was more than just a product of the streets. He was a product of a deeply turbulent, divided America. Growing up in a family heavily involved in the Black Panther Party, Tupac was always aware of the struggles facing the African American community, particularly the disenfranchised youth. His music reflected this reality. Tupac's music was powerful not only because of the raw emotion he conveyed, but also because of his fearlessness in tackling controversial topics. In the same year that Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg had elevated the West Coast with the Chronic and Doggy Style, Tupac released his debut album, Tupacalypse Now. The album was a game changer. Its themes of police brutality, gang violence, and the struggles of young black men were starkly relevant, and tracks like Brenda's Got a Baby and Trapped gave a voice to those who had long been silenced. Tupac was relentless in his pursuit of telling the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made people. He had a unique ability to convey the emotional weight of social issues, especially those that were often ignored or misunderstood by mainstream media. The impact of his early work was profound, and his ability to speak to the disenfranchised youth gave him an unprecedented level of respect within the hip-hop community. However, Tupac was also a man caught between worlds. His involvement with Death Row Records, and in particular, with Suge Knight, marked a turning point in his career. In 1995, after a stint in prison, Tupac joined Death Row, making his first appearance on the label with All Eyes on Me, released in February 1996. The album would become one of the most influential and iconic in hip-hop history. All Eyes on Me was a double album, an expansive collection of songs that covered everything from party anthems to powerful political statements. The standout track, California Love, featuring Dr. Dre, became an instant classic. It wasn't just a song, it was a celebration of West Coast culture, from the music to the lowrider cars to the sunny streets of Los Angeles. The song, accompanied by an iconic music video, became the anthem for a generation of West Coast fans. But Tupac's journey wasn't just about music. He was a deeply polarizing figure, someone whose actions and words often seemed to contradict each other. While he spoke about love and unity, he was also embroiled in numerous legal issues and conflicts. The infamous East Coast-West Coast rivalry, exacerbated by the media, would soon reach its breaking point, and Tupac found himself at the center of the storm. By the time All Eyes on Me dropped in 1996, the East Coast versus West Coast rivalry had reached its peak. What was initially a competitive spirit between two different sounds had spiraled into a personal and dangerous conflict. The media played a major role in inflaming this rivalry, with sensationalized stories, public feuds, and accusations flying back and forth. The animosity between Tupac and the Notorious B.I.G., once friends, had turned into one of the most infamous rivalries in the history of music. Tupac believed that his former friend Biggie Smalls and his associates were somehow involved in the 1994 shooting incident that left him hospitalized. The betrayal he felt was palpable, and this personal grudge boiled over into public diss tracks like Hit 'Em Up, a scathing attack on Biggie, his label, and the entire East Coast rap scene. Tupac's anger was fierce, and his music reflected his pain and distrust. But it wasn't just about music. This was about loyalty, honor, and betrayal. themes that resonate deeply in hip-hop culture. The media fed into the rivalry, with outlets often portraying the conflict between the two camps as an epic battle between the coasts. What was once a celebration of hip-hop culture had turned into something far more dangerous. The West Coast, with its loud, brash, and unapologetic attitude, had become a target for critics, while the East Coast rappers, Biggie and his associates, stood as representatives of a different vision of hip-hop. It wasn't just music anymore, it was a cultural war. On September 7, 1996, Tupac Shakur was shot multiple times in a drive-by shooting in Las Vegas while riding in a car with Suge Knight. Six days later, Tupac died from his injuries at the age of 25. His death marked the tragic end of an era in hip-hop, an era where West Coast dominance was unquestionable, and a time when the future of hip-hop seemed brighter than ever.
Rap star Tupac Shakur died last night after a brief life in a rough business. He was 25. Here's NBC's Stan Bernard.
Tupac's passing devastated his fans, and the entire hip-hop community was thrown into mourning. 6 months later, in March 1997, the Notorious B.I.G. was also shot in a drive-by shooting in Los Angeles. The events surrounding his death mirrored those of Tupac's, further cementing the East Coast-West Coast conflict as the defining tragedy of the era. With Tupac and Biggie gone, the landscape of hip-hop was left forever changed. The rivalry that had dominated the rap scene had come to a tragic end, leaving the world to question what could have been if the two legends had been able to reconcile. In the aftermath of Tupac's death, Death Row Records began to unravel. The empire that Suge Knight had built began to crumble, with legal troubles mounting and financial troubles soon to follow. Dre had already left Death Row in 1996, but his departure was part of a larger shift in the industry. Without its two biggest stars, Tupac and Dr. Dre, Death Row was no longer the powerhouse it had once been. As the late 90s progressed, the West Coast's hold on hip-hop began to loosen. The East Coast, led by artists like Jay-Z, Nas, and the emergence of Wu-Tang Clan, took back control of the genre. The South began to rise as well, with the emergence of artists like Outkast and Master P, redefining what it meant to be successful in hip-hop. The West Coast, once untouchable, was no longer the dominant force in the genre. But this wasn't the end of the West Coast. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. By the late 90s, the West Coast hip-hop scene was in turmoil. The deaths of Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. marked the end of an era, and West Coast hip-hop's reign over the genre seemed to be over. Dr. Dre had already left Death Row in 1996, signaling a change in direction for the West Coast. After his departure, Dre founded Aftermath Entertainment, where he would go on to sign artists like Eminem, 50 Cent, and The Game. While Dre's move wasn't a sign that he had turned his back on the West, it was clear that the West Coast had entered a new phase, one where the loud, brash sound that defined G-Funk had given way to new influences and evolving trends within hip-hop. While the mainstream hip-hop scene had moved away from the West Coast, there were still artists within the region keeping the flame alive, waiting for the right moment to rise again. That moment came in 2005 with the release of The Game's debut album, The Documentary. Coming out of Compton, The Game was one of the few West Coast rappers who seemed poised to carry the torch that had been passed down from the likes of Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Tupac. The Game's The Documentary was a statement, a declaration that the West Coast was back and ready to reclaim its place in the spotlight. The Game wasn't alone in his mission. Behind him was Dr. Dre, who had been in the background, working with the young artist to bring the West Coast sound back to life. Dre's production on the documentary brought the unmistakable G-Funk vibe back, infusing the album with the kind of bass-heavy beats, slow rhythms, and West Coast swagger that had defined the genre in its heyday. Tracks like Hate It or Love It and How We Do were the anthem of a new generation of West Coast hip-hop fans, bringing a fresh sound while respecting the past. The success of the documentary was proof that the West Coast wasn't dead. It was simply waiting for the right artist to reinvigorate it. The Game's rise marked the start of a new wave of West Coast hip-hop artists. a group that would be more diverse and innovative than ever before, but still deeply rooted in the tradition of the pioneers who came before them. While The Game's The Documentary was a critical and commercial success, it wasn't the final step in the revival of the West Coast. The Game had helped reignite the flame, but it was Kendrick Lamar who would ultimately redefine what it meant to be a West Coast artist in the 21st century. Kendrick Lamar's early mixtapes, especially Overly Dedicated, 2010, and Section .80, 2011, introduced him as a gifted storyteller with a unique perspective on life in Compton. But it was his major label debut album, Good Kid, Mad City, released in 2012, that solidified Kendrick as one of the most important voices in hip-hop and a true heir to the legacy of Tupac Shakur. Kendrick's storytelling ability was unlike any other rapper's. Good Kid, Mad City was a concept album, a cinematic exploration of his adolescence in Compton, filled with vivid details, emotional depth, and raw honesty. It wasn't just a collection of songs, it was a film in audio form, taking listeners through the trials, tribulations, and triumphs of a young man growing up in a world filled with violence, gang culture, and systemic injustice. The album was widely acclaimed for its lyrical depth, production value, and Kendrick's ability to blend the personal with the universal. With tracks like Swimming Pools, Drank, and Bitch Don't Kill My Vibe, Kendrick Lamar brought the West Coast sound into the modern era, pushing the boundaries of what hip-hop could be while staying true to the roots of West Coast rap. Good Kid, M.A.A.D. City, was hailed as one of the best rap albums of the 2010s and was a critical turning point for the West Coast in the new millennium. But Kendrick's impact went beyond just music. Like Tupac before him, Kendrick was able to capture the struggles of the African American experience, especially in inner-city communities, and translate them into a language that resonated with listeners worldwide. His activism, his words, and his willingness to speak on issues of race, identity, and social justice made him the voice of a new generation. With Kendrick, the West Coast had found its new voice, one that was both introspective and outwardly revolutionary, with a deep connection to the struggles of the past and a vision for a better future. While Kendrick Lamar was rewriting the rules for West Coast hip-hop, another artist was emerging from the streets of Los Angeles with a vision that extended far beyond music. Nipsey Hussle was not just a rapper. He was a businessman, an entrepreneur, and a symbol of what it meant to take control of your destiny. Nipsey's rise was unconventional. He wasn't signed to a major label and didn't rely on the traditional path to success. Instead, he embraced independence, building his own brand and releasing his music on his own terms. His 2013 mixtape Crenshaw was a pivotal moment in his career. Nipsey made headlines by selling 1,000 copies of the mixtape for $100 each, proving that the value of art was not just in its popularity, but in the ownership of one's work. Nipsey's commitment to his community, his dedication to ownership, and his entrepreneurial spirit set him apart from his peers. He wasn't just rapping about the streets, he was actively working to change them. Through his Marathon clothing store, his investments in real estate, and his philanthropic efforts, Nipsey Hussle became a symbol of what it meant to rise from the struggle and create lasting change. His music, which focused on themes of resilience, self-empowerment, and the importance of ownership, resonated deeply with his fans. In 2019, Nipsey was tragically killed outside his store in South LA, but his legacy continues to influence the West Coast hip-hop scene. His impact goes beyond just the music he left behind. He inspired a generation to think differently about success, wealth, and what it means to truly own your future. While Kendrick Lamar and Nipsey Hussle represent the modern evolution of West Coast hip-hop, there's another artist who is pushing the boundaries even further. Tyler, the Creator, who emerged from the Odd Future Collective, has redefined what it means to be a West Coast artist. His genre-blending sound, eccentric style, and fearless approach to creativity have helped push the boundaries of what West Coast hip-hop can be. Tyler's music incorporates elements of jazz, alternative rock, and electronic music, making him one of the most innovative artists in the industry today. With his album, Flower Boy, 2017, Tyler earned critical acclaim, showcasing his growth as an artist and his ability to tackle complex themes like loneliness, sexuality, and mental health. Tyler, the Creator's success proves that West Coast hip-hop is no longer confined to a single sound or style. It's a diverse and evolving genre, shaped by new artists with fresh perspectives. The future of West Coast hip-hop is bright. With every new artist who emerges, the sound, the culture, and the legacy continue to grow. And no matter where hip-hop goes next, the West Coast will always be at the heart of it, shaping the music and culture for generations to come. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the legacy of West Coast hip-hop, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Drop a comment below and let us know which West Coast artist or moment in history shaped your love for hip-hop. Don't forget to share this with anyone who needs to hear the story of the West Coast's influence. Subscribe if you want to see our future videos, and drop a comment with your favorite West Coast rapper. See you in the next one.